11 years ago, here on YouTube, I started a series that I called Dixie Raising. And the original thought of that series was to talk about my growing up in the rural South from 1945 up until 1965, when I graduated out of high school. And it's taken me a long while to move just a very few years in that series due to not doing it continuously. I think right now I'm on episode 9, and due to being long-winded, I haven't really progressed that far in the series. But somebody mentioned to me the other day that the number 2 episode of that series, which was made, believe it or not, 11 years ago, had no audio on it. So I went back and looked at it, and sure enough, the video is still there for episode 2, but there is no audio on it. And I think what happened there is at one time YouTube would turn off sound on videos that they found any copyrighted material in, and I think I'd used a little introduction tune in that series, in that episode 2, that was possibly copyrighted, so they turned off the sound. So I promised that person, and I can't remember now who it was, but promised them that I'd go back and remake episode 2. So the title of this one you will see will be the remake of episode 2 of the Dixie Raising series. So that's where we are. When you go back and look at the former episodes, episode 1, you'll see I ended episode 1 when my father returned from training for World War II. And he returned home in February of 1945. And at that time, my mother and brother were living on a family farm that was owned by my grandfather. My grandfather on my dad's side. And they had lived on that family farm while my dad was off in service. And due to the time it was, in the economic conditions in the South at that time, a lot of people lived what they called at that time dirt poor. And I think my family was in that category as being living dirt poor. My grandmother and grandfather had a fairly good house on that farm. It was a large farm. I think it was like something like 360 acres that they farmed at that time, raising cotton and corn and livestock and anything you can name. They had fruit trees and raised their own honey. So it was a kind of a self-supporting farm. And also on that farm were several older buildings, or even tenant buildings that in different places around the farm. My 2 uncles lived on the farm at that time. One of them also went off to the service. The other uncle stayed and helped on the farm. But anyway, my mother and brother moved, when my dad left the service, moved into one of the old buildings on that farm. And as it turned out, this old building was a pioneer log cabin that had been built. I guess nobody really knows when it was built, but it was probably built back in the mid to late 1800s. And it was a single room log cabin, the old traditional style of log cabin, that had hewn logs and nothing that was modern about it. And it was still in that condition when my mother and brother moved into it in the late fall or winter of 1944. And of course they were still living there when Dad came back from service in February of 1945. The old cabin, I think it did later on have an addition that was put on the front of it, kind of like a little kitchen addition. For heating in the old cabin, it only had one big limestone rock fireplace that they used for heating. And then I think back, and I know my mother and brother lived there through the winter. It was still wintertime when I was born in that old log cabin. And of course, I think we lived there maybe a year after my birth. I don't remember, of course, I don't remember any of living there. All I know and can relate is what I was told by my parents and my brother later on about living in the old cabin. I did get to go back before the cabin was torn down and visit it and remember what it looked like and the place it was located and things like that. But I have no remembrance of living there, of course, that first year. But the things I've been told was everything was primitive. It had no electricity, of course, no telephone, had no running water, had no indoor restroom, bathroom facilities. There was a creek nearby, a stream, a spring, I guess you could call it, that came off of the mountain that was right behind the cabin. And this cabin was located up in a pasture on that farm. And there was trails up to the cabin, but no road had been built then to the cabin, nor is a road to that area built even today, these many years later. That 1945, so that was about over 70 years ago when I was born there. So it was a pioneer log cabin, used, I guess, the wood for heat. They probably had a wooden stove that burned wood to cook on. I guess they spent a lot of time with my grandparents. From that cabin down to my grandparents' house was probably right at 3/4, maybe a mile between the cabin and the main house where my grandparents lived. The mountain that is located, as I've said before, I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and there was a small mountain that was to the north of the cabin, and that small mountain was called Poorhouse Mountain, and that's probably close to the way it was at that time, being named Poorhouse Mountain. So anyway, my dad came back in February of 1945. My mother and brother still living there. And I'm sure when he came back, my grandfather and my uncles were probably glad to see him come back since he could be of help on the farm. He had no outside job at that time, so in my remembrance of what I've been told and just thinking of how it probably happened, he came back and started helping my grandfather and my uncle on the farm. And I suppose he had not much pay. I suppose the main part of helping on the farm was it gave them a place to live and something to eat. So that was my start in life, was in that old log cabin. And I've always kind of been glad that I wasn't born off in a hospital. I was born at home and in a pioneer log cabin, which is, some people said, well, you're kind of like Abraham Lincoln. But if you think about it, even though we were living in pioneer conditions when I was born, the rest of the country and the rest of the world weren't in that condition. I thought quite a bit how it must have been off into some of the bigger towns, some of the bigger cities, especially like, world cities like New York or London, how much better the conditions were because they had electricity. By 1945 had telephones and indoor plumbing and running water, heated water and all that. So we were in primitive conditions, and the rest of our part of the country was still in not modern conditions in 1945 due to especially the Appalachian Mountains lagging behind the rest of the country, and the South, the deep South at that time, still lagging behind the rest of the country. And you have to remember, 1945 was only, like 12, 15 years after the end of the Great Depression. But I've heard my teachers and others talk about it, and they said the Great Depression didn't end in this country till around 1950, till after World War II. So my dad came back, got back into the family thing and the farmer thing, helping on the farm and being a family man. And my birth was in November 27th of 1945. Like I say, he got back in February. 9 months later, in November, I was born in that log cabin. So at that time, like I say, the conditions were not good. There wasn't a road up to the cabin. And I've heard the tale, and it's told by my mother and father and my brother have told me that. But they told me that the conditions were bad on that November night. It was raining. It had been raining for several days, and that's typical in this part of the country. In wintertime, we'll get quite a bit of rain. Don't get a lot of snow, but do get quite a bit of rain. And the nearest road at that time that came up to that cabin was maybe a mile and a half down across the pasture, past where my grandparents lived, and out to a dirt road that came into that part of the county. This area where the cabin was located, where my grandfather's farm was located, was known then and is known now as Fairfield, Alabama. And it was called Fairfield because an original church that was there was called Fairfield Baptist Church. And I suppose the name Fairfield came from it being in a agricultural community, and there were a lot of nice, well-kept fields in the area, so you would suppose they called it Fairfield because of that. The nearest, what might be called an incorporated town, a very, very small town, was Hollywood, Alabama, which is maybe 3 or 4 miles kind of to the south of this rural area of Fairfield. And it was only a small town because the railroad ran through there, and there was a stop there for the trains. And there was a few buildings there, but it's a very, very small town. So that was conditions, and that was the place and the time that got me through my first year. Now I'm thinking that since I was born in November, that we lived in that cabin for possibly a year after my birth. And the reason I think that was, I know we were, of course, living there when I was born. That would have been after crop gathering time. But if you went a few months ahead of that, it would have been time to plant crops. And I'm thinking that my father would have stayed on in that location and helped with the planting of the crops in 1946, tended the crops and the animals on the farm through the summer of 46. And I'm relatively sure he stayed on for the gatherings of the crops in 1946. But I don't know have an exact date. And like I say, I think we're only there a year. And of course, I have no remembrance of it, and both my parents are gone on, so I can't ask them when we moved out of that cabin. My brother would only have been about 6 years old. Now, he might remember when we moved out of that cabin, but I'm sure my father thought and knew that he needed to move on from the farm, since he had a family now, a wife and 2 children, that he would move on and go out and get a paying job, and that's what he did. And I think that's what brought on our move. In episode 3, you'll see I talk about us moving into an old, dilapidated, previous Baptist church in that small town of Hollywood that I just mentioned, and that he went to work for a small business there in that small town. But that comes up in episode 3. So this hasn't been very long, and I'm going to try to keep the future episodes from drawing out so long, but maybe this goes back and fills in the blank that was there for episode 2, since it had no sound on it. So I'll see you again, and I guess it'll be episode 9 or 10. I'm not sure which one comes, at what point I left off. I think it's episode 9 maybe. But that'll be the next one that I record. And if you want, you can go back and start with episode 1 and go through all eight or nine episodes, whatever I have, if you want to catch up on what I've said in the past. Like I say, these things went back for 11 years, and it's taken me 11 years to get through those episodes. But I'm really going to try to start making them maybe 1 or 2 a month would let me move on. I've got a long way to go from being a child up to being out of high school, so I need to move on. Thanks for watching. This is Mess About One, also known as Richard Matthews, and I'll talk to you later.